Volume 1, Chapter 8 of The Female American, or The Adventures of Unca Eliza Winkfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Hermit Dies, the Idol of the Sun described, discovers a subterranean cell that leads to the inside of the idol, a terrible tempest. Finding the hermit stopped his discourse, I told him I believed that he really saw me, for that about a month ago, as already related in the foregoing part of my life, the day I was put upon the island, I stood at the door of his cell, fearful to enter. I then imagined that I heard a human voice calling to me. The fright drove me into the cell. From that time to this, I could never account for it, but concluded afterwards that the noise existed only in my fearful imagination. During our conversation, we refreshed ourselves with some goat's flesh and roots, and now the night being far spent, I persuaded the hermit, after much entreaty, to repose himself on the stone couch whilst I sat in the chair. The sun was far advanced the next morning, when I found the hermit still reclined on the couch. I thought he might still be sleeping, and went softly out to get some goat's milk for our breakfast, and after my return waited some hours for his awaking. But as he did not stir, I began to suspect he might be dead. At last I persuaded myself to go nearer, and now perceived he was really so. I was sorry so soon to have lost his society, from which I promised myself much solace. As it was impossible for me to remove him, had I been ever so desirous, I immediately set myself to convey everything out of the room into another, which I found equally convenient. Only I had the trouble to gather moss and leaves to lay upon the couch. When I quitted the room entirely, I pulled the door after me, and with loose stones, of which there were plenty, so closed it up that no creature could enter. The day was now too far spent to renew the searches of the day before, which I therefore deferred till the next day, when I awoke early, and having provided for my sustenance as before, once more visited 3 solitary ruins. Meeting nothing new, I endeavored to find my way to the idol, which was not very difficult, as the ruins of the buildings continued quite from my first cell to the idol. As I approached nearer to it, I found the form of the building to vary much from what I had before seen. The rooms or cells here were much larger than the dormitories, and where I supposed the apartments, some of which were still entire, which the priests inhabited. By all that I could see, I concluded that this palace had never been raised higher than 1 story, which might be the reason that it covered so great an extent of the ground. Now, at the distance of about a mile from the place of my abode, as near as I could calculate, I came near to the idol, and here I suppose the temple began, for I found no more apartments, but the remains of a wall, which had anciently, no doubt, surrounded the idol, and left a large area in the middle. In the center stood this idol. Round it was an ascent of 20 stone steps. The image itself of gold greatly exceeded human size. It resembled a man clad in a long robe or vest, which reached quite down to the pedestal stone or foundation on which it stood, and lay in folds upon it. This image was girt about the waist as with a girdle, and on each breast gathered to a point, fastened as it were with a button, the neck and bosom quite bare, like the manner of women. On the head was a curiously wrought crown, and between the 2 breasts an image of the sun carved in gold, as was all the rest of it. The right hand supported the figure of a new moon, and the left held a cluster of stars. On the back part of the idol was written in large Indian characters, to this purpose, "The Oracle of the Sun." I ascended the steps and threw a stone at the image, and found it was hollow. Having now pretty well satisfied my curiosity, I began my walk home again. In my way thither, as I kept a straight way as nearly as the buildings would admit, I struck my foot against something and fell down. I got no hurt. As soon as I was up again, I turned round to see at what I had stumbled, and found it to be a large iron bar. Upon removing the earth that covered part of it, I discovered a kind of trap door of the same metal of which this was a part, and 2 strong bolts. I endeavored, with stones, to force the bolts open, but did not effect it without great labor, and then, with equal difficulty, pulled the door up, on the inside of which were 2 other bolts to fasten it with inside. A stone staircase presented itself. I went down a few steps, but as they led me under the earth, I found it too dark to proceed without a light. But my curiosity was so much excited that I determined to go home and fetch a light to explore this subterraneous cavity. For this purpose, I brought 3 shell lamps and my tinder box. As soon as I was got to the bottom of the stairs, and had lost all sight of the light above, I sat down one of my lighted lamps. At a further distance I sat down another in the same manner, and with a third, and my tinder box, in case the light should go out, then proceeded. I made use of these 3 lights to render the passage less terrifying, and that I might be in less danger of being left in total darkness. I found this passage very narrow, capable of admitting only 1 person to walk abreast, but high enough to admit a person of more than the highest stature. Almost all the way on each side there were a kind of niches or holes. Upon examining them, I found they contained a variety of things, all of gold, of which I knew not the use, besides a great number of rings, bracelets, lamps, and crowns. An immense treasure. A little further I discovered a kind of room, pretty spacious. In this hung up a great many, as I supposed, sacred vestments. These were formed of gold wire, or rather of narrow plaited gold, curiously folded, or twisted together like network. I was surprised to find how little they were tarnished, but the place in which they hung was very dry, and had very little air. Among these vestments were some of more extraordinary workmanship and richness. The largest was, as it were, sprinkled over with precious stones, and here and there a large diamond. It appeared to be in the same fashion with which the statue of the sun was clothed. By this hung a kind of close vest or cassock of the same make, designed, I suppose, to be worn under the other, with diamond buttons to fasten it. Near this was a crown of most exquisite make, richly beset with precious stones of various sizes and colors, one on the top particularly large, which emitted from all parts of it a light greater than that of my lamp. In the same room was a golden staff or rod with a small image of the sun on top of it. I supposed these last 2 vestments might have belonged to the high priest, and the staff likewise. In looking over the gold rings, I found one which was set round with precious stones, with a very large one in the middle, which shone with a luster equal to that on the top of the crown, as I suppose the high priests wore. This I put on one of my fingers, and 2 of the richest bracelets, beset with precious stones, on each of my arms. Having sufficiently satisfied my curiosity with looking at treasures that could yield me no real service, I walked on a little further, and found another flight of stairs. These I ascended, wondering whether they should lead me. They were very narrow and steep, which I soon found led me up into the image of the sun. At last I got quite into the body of it, and my head within the head of it. There were holes through the mouth, eyes, nose, and ears of it, so that I could distinctly see all over the island before me, of which the height I was at gave me a great command. I indeed thought I could even behold the sea. My astonishment was so great at what I had seen that I exclaimed aloud, "What wonders are here!" As I spoke these words pretty loud, I had scarcely uttered them before I was almost stunned with the sound of my own voice. This image, particularly the head of it, it seems, was so wonderfully constructed as to increase the sound of even a low voice to such a degree as to exceed that of the loudest speaker. for afterwards saying, in as low a voice as I could, "What a knowledge of mechanics must the ancients have had!" I might, I dare say, have been heard as far as the human voice is commonly heard intelligibly. Nothing, therefore, could be more natural for me to conclude than that this image was anciently used to give out oracles. I tried to sing a hymn in my usual pitch of voice, but the sound was too much for my ears to bear, and I was obliged to lower my key. I now thought it time to descend and go home, lest the night should come on me. The extraordinary things that I had seen afforded me a variety of agreeable reflections in my way home, and took off the horror of the gloominess that the approaching evening shed around me. Nor did the thought of walking among the remains of the dead give me the least terror. Having reached my cell and prepared to take my rest, I was alarmed with a loud clap of thunder. I cannot say terrified, for I naturally love to hear it thunder. There is something awful and great in it that always composes my mind, raises it above the things of sense, and fills my mind with noble and exalted ideas of God, whose presence, I think, as it were, bespeaks. I bow and reverence, for though sensible that both it and lightning are the effects of natural causes, yet I consider them as under the direction of God, and doubt not that they are sometimes directed to answer some particular ends of providence. Storms of this kind, that sometimes happen in Europe, are by no means to be compared to those in these parts, and of the latter sort was that which I am now mentioning. The claps of thunder were prodigious, loud, and long, the lightning almost without intermission. I was fearful that the stone room I sat in might be thrown down, and therefore went out. But what did I behold? Imagination can scarcely conceive such a total darkness as then covered the earth, as if every particle of light had been annihilated, and primitive chaos had once more resumed its reign, when in an instant the thunder roared, as if the whole earth had been bursting into atoms, whilst the lightning showed the air one entire body of liquid fire, and so illumined the earth, that I knew not which was brighter, that or the air. It was too much to bear. I again sought my cell, and there trembling waited the dissolution of all things, as I indeed then expected. I suppose this dreadful hurricane might continue 2 hours, when it gradually expired, or rather seemed to retire elsewhere in more low and distant sounds, and all was calm as though it had always been so. I soon became composed myself, and once more retired to rest. But what a new scene presented itself the next morning, when I came out of my habitation to view the effects that the last night might have produced. My way was frequently obstructed by trees torn up with their roots, and scattered here and there, and the earth in many places covered with the bodies of dead birds, goats, etc., and the carcasses of other small animals, whose names I knew not. But when I approached the seashore, the objects were changed, but to such as still showed how dreadful the storm had been. The foam, which the agitated sea had thrown on the shore, lay in great quantities, intermixed with a prodigious number of dead fish, some of an enormous size. Many of the rocks were rent in pieces, and their broken fragments made a horrid appearance. What a subject of speculation here for a philosopher! I now turned my steps back to the more inland parts, where I beheld the same havoc made among the trees, beasts, and birds, but no hurt done to the remains of the palace, which I supposed owed its security from the general desolation to the lowness of it. But I must confess I trembled for the statue of the sun, though I knew not why, for what was it to me whether it stood or fell? As soon as I came near enough, I saw it was safe, and was far from being displeased that it was so. I now returned home, and having thoroughly gratified my curiosity in searching among the ancient ruins and exploring the contents of them, I spent my time in my little domestic concerns, my devotions, and reading the few books that I found in my chest. End of chapter 8.